Hey guys, this is Illusion PODFIC, and today we're going to be reading The Heir to Stark Industries by Only Forward. The summary is, Peter Parker doesn't know it yet, but he's the heir to Stark Industries. This fic is basically Tony training him to be the heir by making Peter act as CEO during the Young Boss protocol, where Peter takes charge of the company in case of emergencies. Essentially, Peter does cool stuff at Stark Industries, and also there's a field trip fic in Chapter 4, because everyone loves a field trip fic. Alright, and without further ado, let's jump right into Chapter 1. Peter Parker was the heir to Stark Industries. The papers had been drawn up. Tony had signed as the official owner of SI. Pepper had signed, the exhausted CEO, happy to hand over the legacy. Aunt May had signed, the guardian. The only one who hasn't signed yet was Peter, the unknowing heir. Peter had worked as an unofficial intern for over 2 years. His official title, if anyone asked, was Tony Stark's personal intern. But he worked in the R&D lab to help out the other interns regularly and knew a lot of the interns fairly well. Any one of the SI employees who had met Peter had spoken highly of him. Polite, funny, slightly shy until he became more comfortable with the environment and started to show his prowess. Once he got used to the labs, he was happy to walk around and dabble in people's projects, giving them needed assistance. The interns were smart. They had to be to get into the program. But Peter Parker had a subtle intelligence that was incomparable to any of the other interns. They should loathe him for being a high school kid and smarter than any of them, but he was too damn nice to hate. It was for all these reasons that there was a protocol within Stark Industries called the Young Boss Protocol. It was only to be implemented if both Pepper Potts and Tony Stark were both in emergency situations and needed someone to take over Stark Industries for a period of time. Peter Parker would immediately become head of command, taking his rightful position as the heir. Peter, of course, had no clue about either of these, being the heir or the Young Boss Protocol. Every time Tony tried to bring it up with Peter, he chickened out. The kid was unbelievably ignorant of the entire situation, despite being a literal genius. He'd assumed some whispers about being the heir would have trickled down, but nothing. Pepper and May had left the subject to Tony to encroach upon. Tony had eventually, after much dabbling, brought it up with Peter when they'd been tinkering with the Mark 62, the latest Iron Man suit. Pepper and I had been thinking, Tony had said, spinning a spanner in his hand loosely. How do you feel about maybe having a bigger role in Stark Industries? Peter looked at him with a grin. Attention shifted from the helmet he was tinkering with. Like, an intern? An intern. Tony was supposed to be telling the kid that he was the heir to the company, and he thought he was going to be an intern? He wanted to chuckle. Pepper had agreed that it was better to tell Peter earlier than later. Hell, everyone else pretty much could tell that Peter was the future of Stark Industries, from the way he could casually walk into the intern labs and solve equations without spending much more than a second looking at it, and from the endless amount of official projects he had cut budgets on by solving problems. It was clear. His selfless nature left everyone else in awe, and Peter was still coming out of those situations thinking he'd done the normal thing just to help people out. Tony smiled at him. I was thinking a little more like intern director. He couldn't just drop the whole heir thing on Peter quite yet. The kid would probably faint on the spot, especially if he'd been so excited about just being a proper intern. They'd have to phase up to it. That was okay. That was what the Young Boss Protocol was supposed to be for anyways. To get Peter used to being in control of Stark Industries. Intern director? Peter's mouth fell open, and he somehow managed to knock the tub of Stark raving hazelnuts ice cream onto the floor. They'd had a mini fridge and freezer installed in the lab ever since Tony found out that Peter was significantly more efficient and more creative if he was constantly snacking on something. Also, the both of them managed to forget that their bodies needed food to function, and would just work for 9 hours before collapsing from hunger they hadn't noticed. The ice cream was a favorite of Peter's, so Tony had made sure to keep a permanent stock of it in the freezers amongst other things. When Ben & Jerry's had asked if Tony wanted to discontinue the flavor, as it was only supposed to be a limited edition, he had arranged for their creative team to meet with Peter, who'd begged the entire company to keep it going. There had been tears. It had worked surprisingly well, and the director of Ben & Jerry's had agreed to continue Stark raving hazelnuts after meeting Peter, possibly out of fear. It had then quickly become a permanent flavor, and Tony had silently thanked the Lord. He didn't want to live in a world where Peter's favorite ice cream flavor was discontinued. Yeah, kid, you'd be looking over the interns, keeping them on track. If they have any requests or demands that override their intern head, they can come to you. Technically, that would be part of Peter's role once he became a fully fledged boss, so Tony wasn't lying. An intern director would be a good role for the kid, even if it had just been made up on the spot. He basically checked up on all the interns anyway, when he was wandering around the labs, and this just made it official. Tony made a mental note to make sure that SI hadn't already hired an intern director. That would be a conflict of interest. There were intern heads, of course, Tony mentally scoured through the list of employees for Stark Industries' research and development team. Pepper would not be pleased. But Mr. Stark, Peter's brow furrowed, I'm only 17. Surely there's someone more capable to be the director of all the interns. I mean, holy moly, I've never even had a proper job before, except working for that one summer at Delmar's. Tony stared at him. Pete, kid, you've been working with me for years. You're the smartest person I know except for maybe myself and Bruce Banner. You've got this. Peter started to shake his head, but I have no experience managing people. Tony looked at his kid, wearing a crumpled hoodie, donning the words, what part of incredibly complicated math equation do you not understand? He'd seen Peter Parker argue with him to death about repulsor technology, and quite correctly in the end. Peter had presented his argument with a completely calm face, voice getting louder but remaining clear to understand. It had in fact become quite scary. He'd be able to manage people no problem. Trust me, kid, you'll ace it. And if you don't like it, then we'll find you a different role. But you've got this. Tony punched his kid's arm and watched as Peter gulped and nodded. Unbeknownst to him, from then on, Peter was the third in command. Pepper, as CEO, still ranked first, and then Tony. But ranking above any of the other heads of departments or members of the board was Peter. The appropriate people had been informed, intern heads and the like, and this information had quietly trickled down to the lower level employees. Anyone who questioned why some teenager, now ranked above them, was reprimanded strongly by Pepper herself, and no one went against Pepper Potts. It turned out that Peter was actually a very good manager. The shy kid from Midtown High who sat in the back had no problem reprimanding some of the interns for when they exploded a room, although had acknowledged it was an accident and had been pleasant in reminding them that they needed to either check their equations before doing the experiment or relocate to one of the explosion-proof rooms. Peter had quite enjoyed overseeing all the interns' projects. He'd actually given some of them other ideas to spring off. It had led to several inventions being published with Peter's name attached to them, which pleased him greatly. Peter had to manage school alongside his job, so his hours were largely in the evening, overseeing projects, and then whenever he had free periods, and had the time to. Pepper came and checked on him frequently to make sure he was still doing his homework, as that was equally as important as the job he was doing at Stark Industries. But Peter had never had troubles with schoolwork. The new role just gave him something else to focus on as well. Tony and Peter still found time to do their lab sessions, in which they talked about the suits and tech they were working on, but also spent the time discussing projects for the business, learning about the developments of Stark Industries to keep Peter up to date with the SI projects. He quite quickly found himself settling into the role, and even enjoying it. As Peter started to confess how he actually liked the role to Tony, Tony suggested casually that he should come to a meeting with some clients. You know, intern director. You should be kept informed. Come to a meeting. It'll be fun. You don't have to say or do anything. Tony had waved his banner at Peter. Just be yourself. The first board meeting Peter had been invited to, he'd been quiet but attentive. He turned up in a shirt with a fitted cashmere sweater, explaining that he spent his first paycheck on buying some fancy clothes. Tony had freaked out, seeing Peter in clothes that weren't nerd t-shirts, but he had kept it internal, and told the kid that he looked appropriate. Peter had sat next to him, and Tony had calmly explained to the clients why there was a damned high schooler in their confidential meeting. The kid sat and listened, watching as Tony described to the directors of a company who had investments in SI why they should stay invested, and the projected stock increase. It was endearing watching the kid make notes in a little notepad. This really wasn't a meeting that Tony had to attend, really. It should be Pepper taking the meeting. But hell, the CEO had other things to do than reassure some clients that SI wasn't going to go under because of their recent commitment to renewable energy. It wasn't going to go under. The stocks were higher than they'd ever been under Howard. People really liked the Avengers and invested in SI as a way to show support. The Avengers had public funding now because the government had decided to get invested. But all of the extra support, Quinjet, the suits, and repairs for the suits, as well as the extra gear, came from Tony, and therefore by extension, Stark Industries. Pepper and him had agreed that Peter's first official meeting would be a Tony-led thing, so, hence, it had fallen to Tony to lead the meeting with the clients. Later, when Tony and Peter were in the lab, Peter was working on a malfunctioning Iron Man repulsor, and he kept turning the spanner with a force that indicated some frustration. Damn, the kid was bothered. Tony lightly asked Peter what he had thought about the meeting. He'd expected a quiet response, something vague like most teenagers say, fine. Peter had been quiet in the meeting after all. But he'd exploded, complaining about the clients and said that, "They're making you into a pushover, Mr. Stark." The kid had biked him today. Tony grinned and nodded. That's business, Pete. I haven't dealt with clients in many years, so I'll let Pepper give them an ass-kicking when they need to. But don't worry, none of them have a spine. They trust me with their money, they just feel the need to kick up a fuss whenever we join into new projects. The kid grumbled some more, muttering something about how he wanted to see Pepper give them a talking to. Tony made a split-second decision he probably should have thought more about. Pete was ready to hear about the young boss protocol. Kid, how would you feel about an emergency protocol that left you in charge of the place for a bit, if Pep and I were indisposed, so to speak? When you say this place, Pete glanced around the lab. Stark Industries, the New York branch mainly. Hong Kong and London too if Pep isn't over there already. Tony waved his hand loosely, accidentally whacking Dummy in the face. Sorry, buddy. Peter's mouth dropped open. Mr. Stark. He was speechless. Tony's mouth quirked up into another smile. I'm taking that as a yes. Peter was definitely going to reject the offer. But the Young Boss protocol was already up and running. All he needed now was a confirmation from Peter. And all Peter needed was a little bit of confidence. This protocol would give him the confidence he needed. And anyways, it was only for emergencies. Tony, I can't. Peter ran a hand through his hair. I can't run a company. Pete looked like he was going to have a full-scale panic attack. Tony needed to go into damage control mode now. Hey, kid, it probably won't ever happen, Tony reassured. If Pep isn't around, I normally am. Just in case of emergencies. You're the one we trust the most. No biggie. Okay. Pete was biting his nails. Mr. Stark, only if you promise it's emergencies only. Of course, Pete. Of course. No big deal. Tony fist bumped the kid, both of them smiling. Okay, so maybe Peter wasn't entirely ready to hear about being the heir, but this was a big step. He was proud. From then on, Peter was in countless meetings with Pepper and Tony when he felt up to it. He was still balancing seeing Heir along with Spider-Man and practically a full-time job, although it wasn't too much of a burden. Pepper and Tony always made sure he didn't have too much to do, and were more than happy to take work away from him if needed to. Seeing Heir was basically boring anyways. Peter was fluent in Spanish and Italian now, mainly because of Tony's influence. All his science and math subjects were easy as pie anyways, and he would pass English even if he hadn't read the book they'd been said. School was a piece of cake. His real education now came from learning the ins and outs of Stark Industries. If the protocol where he was the boss was ever activated, he would be expected to lead meetings and control all the assets of SI. For that, he needed to know about all the departments: sales, legal, R&D, assembly and production, HR, etc. He spent countless hours going through new Stark Industries initiatives with either Pepper, Tony, or a folder and a wad of papers about the initiatives. He knew about renewable energy, the arc reactors, prosthetics, the Stark phones, and all the other wider technological advances that the company was working on. The first time the Young Boss protocol had been implemented was for an emergency which had happened in Peter's winter break. Tony had been out on an Avengers mission in Washington State, some army using Chitauri tech, which had been zipped up by an extremely intelligent technician who had been forced into it. The Avengers had stepped in to take over the mission from the Washington Police Department, mainly because Bruce personally knew the technician, who had been kidnapped to make the weapons and tortured. The farmhouse that the enemy's base was in was abandoned, and had no cell service. Even if he could have left the fight, Friday wouldn't have been able to call him. Pepper, at the same time, had been out running and had fallen down a flight of stairs and had broken her ankle. She'd be perfectly fine, of course, and had insisted to Tony that she could run the company whilst in hospital, until it was revealed that one of the tendons in her ankle had been severely damaged, and she needed to have surgery under anesthesia to get the surgeons to fix it. Running the company unconscious was not possible. So Friday, recognizing that both Tony and Pepper were MIA, contacted Peter. Peter had been building Legos with Ned, a Star Wars set that he'd been wanting to build for the past month, when he'd gotten the notification. Well, it had actually been Ned who had picked up the phone and said, Peter? Peter had seen that Young Boss protocol has now been activated, notification straight from Friday, and had sped over to his bag, shoving the cashmere sweater into the bag and pulling on the Spider-Man suit. I have to go, Ned, he said breathlessly, no explanation, and had jumped out of the window whilst saying, I'll text you later. Ned didn't even know about the Young Boss protocol. Honestly, it slipped Peter's mind. He hadn't thought it would actually happen. It was faster to swing to his workplace than to get public transportation. He hadn't meant to come into Stark Industries until the next day, because he had been caught up on all of his paperwork and only did alternate days anyways as intern director. It was his winter break, and Tony had insisted he at least have some fun, even if Peter's definition of fun was to spend hours in the lab while with Tony working on tech. Peter knew Tony was on an Avengers mission, but what the hell happened to Pepper? That was his first priority, before finding out what he had to do as now temporary boss of Stark Industries. Holy shit. He was the actual boss at Stark Industries. Damn. Karen, what happened to Pepper? He called out to his AI, swinging in the direction of the tower. Miss Potts went running and broke her ankle. She's going to be fine, but she had to have surgery to check out one of her tendons. Oh man, that sucks. I hope she's okay. Can you patch me into Tony? He's not available right now, Peter, Friday said. He's in a remote area and in the middle of a fight. That's why Young Boss protocol was activated. Okay. Thanks, Karen. It's no problem, Peter. Well, shit. Pepper in surgery and Tony unreachable. He really was in charge. When he swung into one of the open windows of one of the personal labs, he landed in Tony's lap, where he was awaited with a surprise. Whoa. Peter stared at the suit in front of him. It was a really nice suit, with a post-it attached to it. Peter, I thought you needed a suit. I was your young boss now. Smash it. Tony. Mr. Stark had bought him a suit? Well, no wasting time. He quickly pulled off the Spider-Man suit and put on his new suit, which fit perfectly. Then he pulled on his badge, which just said, Peter Parker, Intern Director. He kept forgetting it, and it made Happy really upset when he did. Peter then rubbed the bag with the spider suit into the wall of the lab. It wasn't like anyone would be able to get into the lab other than him anyways, but best not to leave the suit lying on the floor. After the preparation, he finally jumped on the lift to go down to the offices and asked for Friday. Hi, boss. How can I help you today? Peter jumped. Friday called Mr. Stark boss, not him. Oh, Friday. Don't call me boss. I'm not Mr. Stark. Just call me Peter like usual. If you're sure, Peter. Yeah, that was better. Less formalities, the better. This was temporary. Peter was nervous, in charge of a whole company. He breathed out, then asked, What is there that I need to do? There's a board of directors meeting that starts in half an hour, which was, of course, supposed to be led by Pepper. It's to talk about the Stark phones and the next steps for them. Pepper left a research file on her desk that may help you out with that. Legal is also having some issues with the contract. R&D could also use some of the assistance as well, but that's less of a priority. The intern heads have it sorted for now. Thanks, Fry. So, board of directors first. Any other meetings? Colonel Williamson is coming from the U.S. military later on this afternoon at 4 p.m. Oh god, the military. Great. Peter mentally groaned. In his time of initiation for this role, anyone from the military other than Rhodey had never been cooperative. He wasn't looking forward to that. Friday could clearly sense his discomfort. I could suggest that he rearranges for the next day if you would prefer. No, it's okay, Friday. I've got this. Peter cracked his knuckles one by one. The lift was empty. Friday was fast-tracking him to Pepper's office without letting anyone else on. Floor 58 had its own entrance, like a hallway to the office. Pepper's receptionist, Ava, waved at Peter and quickly let him into the office. The room itself had been stunningly designed, with full-length windows and a desk the size of a dining room table. Pepper had truly made it her own after Tony had moved all of his stuff out. There was houseplants everywhere, and the white walls made it open and bright. But Peter had more important things to think about than design. Okay, let's do this. It felt weird to sit in Pepper's chair, but Peter needed to do it to find the file that Friday had mentioned. He sat spinning around in the chair slowly as he read the document. Most of the stuff he had already knew, from just talking with the R&D department about the new specs for the Stark phones. But Peter needed a bit of a brush up on the new photo mode they added that meant that any Stark drone would be able to operate through the camera application instead of an external app. The drones were going to be included in a bundle with the new phone to encourage customers to buy them. Okay, battery duration, preventing storage issues, drone cam, I think I've got it. Friday, where's the meeting? Peter stood up, folder in hand. He tugged on the blazer he wore, trying to get used to the suit. Usual place. The lift is ready for you, Peter. Thanks, Friday. Peter smiled and strolled up to the lift, taking a deep breath. First solo meeting. There was a low rumbling of Mr. Parker, and several nods from the board. Peter wasn't expecting any complaints from these guys. Peter had been in several board meetings. He'd never led any of them, but he often contributed, and the board had been informed of the Young Boss protocol. Is Pepper joining us today? One of the board members, James Young, glanced at the door when everyone was seated. She's in surgery, I'm afraid. I'll direct this meeting and then feedback to her. I promise anything you say to her, you shouldn't hold out on saying to me. Peter smiled. The businessman smiled that Tony had trained him to do. Mr. Young nodded and looked down at the papers. Good. No trouble from him. Now, should we start with the specs for the new generation of Stark phone? There was a collective nod, and then the meeting began. It went well. Peter felt a bit more relaxed after the meeting was done, and there had been no complications. Peter had calmly delivered the information as Pepper would have done. Any question the board members had been answered. On the lift back to Pepper's office, Peter pulled out his phone, concerned by the endless notifications he received during the meeting, causing his pocket to continue vibrating throughout the meeting. 15 texts from Ned, all concerned about where he went abruptly, without explanation. Well, that was fair enough. He probably should have explained, but he'd been in a time crunch due to the meeting. Ned. Dude. Ned. Where did you go? May is wondering. Ned. Do you want me to carry on with the Death Star? Ned. Question mark, question mark, question mark. And 3 missing calls from May, and a text where he was. Peter groaned and punched himself in the forehead, dropping the folder he was carrying. The sheet sprawled everywhere, and he quickly called May back, whilst he shuffled the papers into a pile. He was an idiot, forgetting to tell May. Hey, May, he said, slightly breathless. He really should have texted her. May let out an outburst of questions. Is this some new Spider-Man thing? There's nothing on the news. Is there a Secret Avengers fight? No, May. I'm at Stark Industries. It's, the Young Boss protocol, remember? Tony had informed May of it, explained that would only be enacted in emergencies, and Peter wouldn't be expected to do anything he was uncomfortable with. But truly, May trusted Tony now, and he hadn't needed to explain much before she'd agreed. Oh, do you need to do anything? Are Pepper and Tony okay? Pepper is having surgery for her ankle, but she's going to be fine. Tony is at a Secret Avengers thing, so there was an awkward silence. You're in charge. May said, a bit speechless. You're in charge of Stark Industries. Peter let out a breath, eyes darting around the lift for something to look at. Yep, well, I'll let you get on with your day, May said, voice slightly high-pitched, as though she couldn't quite get her head around it. Peter didn't blame her. He couldn't quite comprehend it either. Don't forget to have lunch. Tell Ned I'm sorry, please. We'll have to take a rain check. Thanks, May. He settled back in Pepper's office, spinning around the chair. Friday. Legal next? I believe that would be the best course of action. Of course. I could have the contract sent up to you if you'd prefer not to go down there. No, it's okay. Peter stood up and wandered back over to the lift. Will you explain the problem to me on the way there? Friday explained the issue they were having. Just some lawsuit with a newspaper publishing a libel about Stark Industries and their weapons business. The head of legal, a guy named Andrew McGuire, needed a signature from a higher-up to authorize the lawsuit they were pursuing against this newspaper. Apparently, Peter's would do as well as Tony's or Pepper's, because he was acting CEO. Who knew? The legal department, from Peter's experience at least, was always a rush of people running places while holding a bundle of papers and folders in their hands, looking stressed. He went over to a couple of people who looked particularly stressed and tried to help solve their problems, even if some of the legal talk went completely over his head. After lending a hand to a couple of people, he went over to McGuire and signed the necessary paper. McGuire thanked him kindly for the signature and left Peter to get on with his day. Next stop, of course, was R&D. His favorite department in the entirety of Stark Industries. This is where the magic happened. The ideas that became reality and were produced. This was the stuff that got Peter's serotonin levels flooding. However, as he walked in, the intern head in charge of all the interns who dealt with Stark phone developments, Lisa, approached him. Peter, lovely to see you. Lisa was blocking his entrance to the interns. Peter was itching to start helping them out, but alas, Lisa was an obstacle. Hi, Lisa. How are you? Brilliant. I had you in charge today. How's it going? Okay, I think. Any explosions down there? Peter glanced into the lab. He could see Jasper. Jasper was this buddy of his who'd gone to MIT for college, and had told him all about the ins and outs of the college experience. He wanted to go and work on their project together, but his eyes danced back to Lisa. No, I think we've got it handled. Feel free to have a wander. I know what you're like. But, Peter, before you go, do you know what time it is? No? Peter glanced down at his phone. A subtly personalized, Spider-Man-themed Stark watch that he adored. A gift from Pepper and Tony for his birthday. Holy crap, it was 2:15. Hell, time had flown. Maybe he'd spent longer in legal than he'd thought. Have you had lunch yet? Lisa asked, clearly concerned. He sheepishly shook his head. I'll be back. I don't doubt that. He grabbed his normal sandwich from the pop-up Delmar store that Tony had insisted be installed in the tower after he had met Mr. Delmar, and had learned how much the man had helped out May and Peter when times had been hard. The free sandwich here and there made all the difference throughout Peter's childhood. As a result, Delmar's son now worked in Stark Industries in the cafeteria. They became fast friends as Peter liked to eat sandwiches, and Mr. Delmar's son was a Spider-Man fan who liked to make Peter the sandwiches. Sandwich in hand, he returned to the R&D department to tinker with some projects he'd been keeping an eye on. Lisa gave him a thumbs up, which he returned, and he got to work. He spent an hour working on all sorts of projects, from experimental visual reality technology to a prosthetic leg that was missing a couple of bolts. Friday then buzzed at him when it was 3:30, and he would have to head up to the offices to prepare for a meeting with the guy from the army. On the way up to Pepper's office, he did a quick Google to read up on Colonel Williamson. He requested a meeting without giving Pepper any indication for what it would be. Peter had been briefed on how to deal with the military, which is basically just to say no to any demand, and try not to get angry. Colonel Williamson wasn't particularly intimidating. Sure, he was a tall, bald guy with bulky muscles, but Tony had told him just to look at his mustache and concentrate on that, because the mustache that the colonel had was very distinctive. Peter had thought that Tony had been joking, but he was right. Williamson's mustache was very distinctive. I was expecting to see Pepper Potts. The colonel looked him up and down. Peter quite calmly looked at the colonel's mustache and simply said, Pepper is currently having emergency surgery. I am having a meeting with you instead. Well, this is preposterous. You look about 16. You should be in school, not trying to lead a meeting. Well, apparently the U.S. military hadn't been told about the Young Boss protocol, which makes sense as they work on an external contract. It truly was a shame that Williamson hadn't been to any of the meetings that Tony had with the military since the Young Boss protocol was implemented, because he's about to make a fool of himself by continuing to undermine Peter's authority. It's winter break, Peter said, still calm. He watched the way Colonel's face reddened in anger. I'd like to speak to someone higher up than some low-level intern doing admin for Stark Industries. I'm from the U.S. military, for God's sake. Give me your manager. The colonel had decided to turn into a Karen now. Great. He was definitely not going to like the plot twist that Peter, in fact, is the manager. I am the manager, Peter said, his voice rising slightly in volume. Please sit down, Colonel. I'm perfectly qualified to have this meeting with you. No, I'm sorry. I won't discuss intricate military policies with a kid. There's no way you're qualified. Peter struggled not to roll his eyes. Yeah, Tony was right. These guys were stubborn assholes. There was only one solution that could possibly make the colonel believe him, short of Tony walking in himself and confirming it. Friday, Could you please play the tape that Mr. Stark recorded? Tony had recorded a tape for people who weren't Stark Industries employees who didn't believe that Peter could possibly be in charge. They'd anticipated this scenario happening, mostly because Peter still looked so young and people were dicks. Of course, Peter. Friday played the audio recording. Listen up, folks. I don't know who you are, but let me just inform you. Peter Parker is currently operating as intermediary CEO to Stark Industries, filling in for Pepper or myself, Tony Stark, of course. He is perfectly capable of leading any meetings and knows the ins and outs of everything going on at Stark Industries. Please do not attempt to undermine his authority, or he is well within his right to cut our contract with you or terminate your employment. The Colonel huffed when the tape reached its end. He looked extremely angry with the tone that Mr. Stark had used. So, Colonel, shall we sit? Clearly still unhappy, he grumbled and sat down. So, how come you get to be in charge while so young? I've been the personal intern of Mr. Stark for years now, and was recently promoted to intern director. Tony and Pepper have trained me, so I have in-depth knowledge of every aspect of the company, and am perfectly qualified to handle meetings like this. But I believe you are not here to discuss my employment, and you did not provide a subject matter, so you should start. Peter was really looking forward to what the Colonel had to say. He fidgeted with a pen under his desk, Pepper's desk, technically. Well, the U.S. military wanted to thank Mr. Stark for his work with us in the past, and we have no problem with our current contracts, of course. The company has treated us extremely well over the years, but we wish to adapt some of the contracts for another purpose, possibly. The Colonel had said many words, and none of them actually contained anything worthwhile. Peter felt the need to clarify. We work with the U.S. military primarily for energy supplies and other minor technological contracts, Colonel. These contracts are non-negotiable and unchanging. I believe you are talking about opening a new contract with us, but what for? Peter could guess where this was going, and he did not want to entertain the possibility. The Colonel shifted in his seat uncomfortably. No, I know that, but the military had a proposition for Mr. Stark. Peter immediately cut the Colonel off. If this is about weapons, I will remind you that Tony Stark stated 10 years ago after being kidnapped and tortured in Afghanistan, we at Stark Industries no longer manufacture, create, or want to supply weapons to the U.S. military or anyone else. I'm not stupid. I know Stark Industries doesn't make weapons anymore. Colonel took the time to have a sip of his coffee. Peter was very determinedly staring at his mustache, which had droplets of coffee in it. The Colonel continued, I want to commission Tony to make us some sets of armor for our use. Peter felt the volume of his voice rise as he continued talking. You're telling me that you want self-operated, military-owned Iron Man suits. Didn't Justin Hammer try that? I'm pretty sure that went down badly. Wasn't there some kind of attack? The Colonel blatantly ignored him, which was fair enough. It was a bit accusatory, and the whole Hammer Tech contract was probably a mistake the U.S. Army wanted to hide under their radar. Tony knows what he was doing with these suits, the Colonel stated. We know he has now made at least 20 of these suits for his personal use. Peter quirked an eyebrow. 20? That was an understatement. And he and the company would be paid very well for doing this for the military. Tony Stark is a billionaire. He knows how to invest, Colonel. With all due respect, I don't think Mrs. Stark nor the company needs your money. Peter took a breath. Look, Colonel, Tony only does things that he knows are morally correct. He had been kind enough to the United States military, I would think, after giving you the very suit that the War Machine currently operates for free, may I add. War Machine is only one man. He cannot protect all of the interests we need defended. These suits, but Peter had heard enough. It's going to be a no, Colonel. The U.S. military has no right to guilt-trip the company into supplying the material. Our energy contract remains out of formality from the past. Tony would not want his suits operating for you. I will speak to Pepper about this, the Colonel warned. I would suggest you do not attempt to do that. I will be informing her, of course, the content of this meeting, and I assure you she will agree with me wholly. Pepper would probably talk more nicely, but it would be the sentiment. There would be no way that Tony would ever commission Iron Man suits for the military. I'm sorry, but I can't take the word of a child, the Colonel spat at him. It sounds like you're undermining my authority. I would be careful doing that, Colonel. Peter stood up, and so did Colonel Williamson. You can tell Tony that his son is exactly like him. Abrasive, arrogant, and a pain in the ass. And with that, the Colonel stalked out of the room, fuming. Peter could imagine the steam smoking out of his ears. He kind of wanted MJ to smoke it, just to have an image. He shook his head. Business today. Goodbye, Colonel. I'm sure I will be seeing you again soon. Peter called out as the Colonel practically ran away down the corridor. Then he collapsed back down in his seat. Damn, one hell of a meeting. He glanced at the ceiling. Tell me you're recording that Friday. Of course, Peter. Unless you ask me not to, I record every meeting that happens in here. Do you want me to share the recording with anyone? Hell no. He didn't want anyone to see that the Colonel had called him that. It would be too embarrassing for Tony to see especially. And he would probably kick the shit out of the Colonel just for his tone. No, not yet. Maybe Pepper when she's back to catch her up to speed. That man is a piece of work. Is there anything else I can help you with? No. Well, actually, Peter hesitated. Friday. Are Mr. Stark and I really that similar? I've analyzed his speech patterns, and I've found that they are a match 85% of the time in reference to your tone, inflection, and level of sarcasm. Especially when you're at work, they tend to align. Well, geez. That guy just called me Mr. Stark's son. That's embarrassing. I didn't even correct him. Peter sat up. Oh, I didn't even correct him. Oh, God. Boss always calls you kid. It's a fair assumption. Colonel Williamson was not the first to assume that you two are biologically related. Peter spun around in his chair. Wait, Friday? Who else has? Captain Rogers made the connection when he was first introduced to you. And I believe Colonel Rhodes and Boss had a very distinct talk after the time he walked into a lab and you were encased in an Iron Man suit that you were working on with Tony. The Colonel was hyperventilating for most of it, assuming you had been neglected for 15 years of your life. Rhodey? Rhodey thought we were related? Peter's eyebrow shot up. Wow, seriously? Isn't he like Tony's best friend? They have known each other since Boss was in MIT as a teenager. And yes, he did think you were related. Tony may have led him on for a little bit before telling him the truth. Wow, that's embarrassing. Peter chuckled to himself and then paused. Wait, did you say Captain Rogers? As in Captain America? As in Mr. Steve Rogers, Captain America? Yes. He also thought you were Tony's son. Peter sat back in his chair. It actually made a lot of sense. When he met Steve, the man had been extremely twitchy and wide-eyed around Peter. Is that why he was so weird around me the first time we met? He kept asking questions about where I was from and my childhood and stuff. Huh, that makes sense. Why on earth did he think we were related? You'd have to ask him yourself that, Peter. But I can think of a few similarities. Best not to think about that. The fact that he was apparently similar to his boss/mentor/father figure. Hopefully Tony hadn't noticed. Speaking of, is Tony back online yet? It would be nice to talk to him, see if there were any problems with Stark Industries that Tony had noticed, which Peter could work on, as there was no more meetings for the day. Not yet, I'm afraid. He's only operating on offline Friday for now. Whilst I'm online with the Stark servers, I'm sure he will be soon though. Probably still in the middle of the mission. He knew how time-consuming certain fights were, and this being a hostage situation, he understood the sensitivity. It wasn't like his call was an emergency anyways. Thanks, Friday. Is it okay if I go back to R&D for a bit? You're the boss, Peter, Friday said, humored. Oh yeah, I'm gonna go to R&D. Back in his favorite department. Lisa requested his assistance in an issue they'd been having with finding the ambient operating temperature for the new Stark phone. After some deliberation and testing, Peter had figured it out and sped up the production by a whole week, giving them more time to perfect the Stark phone and drone bundle instead of worrying about the phone's release. They knew it would sell, the phones always did. They were reasonably priced, good quality, and better than any others on the market. He let the advertising department down in public relations, know about the decreased time needed for production, and then moved on. After helping an intern named Isaac finish off the prosthetic he'd been working on earlier that afternoon and dancing around to help a few others with familiar faces, he glanced at his phone to see he'd missed a call from Pepper. She must have been out of surgery. He signed out of the lab for the night, waving goodbye to Jasper and the others, before returning to Mr. Stark's personal penthouse. Then he called Pepper back. Pepper! Hi, are you okay? Perfectly fine. My ankle's all better, thank you. How are you? How was your day as boss? She sounded tired, Peter noted. That made sense, after the day she'd had. Peter thought about it, reviewing the day in his mind. Really, he wanted to explain everything that happened to him in detail, because there was just so much. But she'd just gotten out of surgery and probably had had an equally tiring day as him. She deserved to rest without him just dumping all of his problems on her. It was exhausting, but good, I think. No explosions. Well, that's better than some of the times Tony has been left in charge. Although normally he's the one who makes the explosions. Peter chuckled. I spoke to Colonel Williamson. I don't think he'll come back for a while. I was a bit, firm. Peter chose a nice word to describe his behavior, thinking back to the insults. Pepper didn't need to know about that. Thanks, Peter. You're a star. I really didn't want to have to deal with him. I just get distracted by his mustache, Peter mused. Anyways, order some dinner and you can crash in the penthouse if you want, or swing back home. I don't mind. I think Tony will be on his way back soon. Oh, cool. I might be asleep by then, but thanks. I'll grab some dinner. Thank you for today, Peter. It sounded like you did a great job. Well, nothing broken at least. He smiled. No problem. I hope you feel better. Bye. Goodbye. Pepper hung up and Peter called the pizza place to get his usual order delivered. He would have ordered something from the cafeteria down below, but it was actually later than he'd thought, so the cafeteria was closed. Even Mr. Delmore's son had gone home. Soon he'd ordered his usual, an extra-large stuffed crust pizza with all sorts of toppings and barbecue sauce. And then he collapsed onto the sofa, thinking about the day. Peter forced his brain not to focus on the actual work side, avoiding thinking about any of the interns' projects, but more of the interns himself. It had been a busy day, but he wished there had been more time to actually connect with the people at Stark Industries. Get to know them. Understanding the company as a whole was necessary to being a CEO. That's what Pepper said anyways. And the employees were key to the company. If he got the time, maybe over his next school break, he'd go on a tour of the building. Mentally, he drew out plans for the next time he visited. to at least meet some new people. When his pizza had finally arrived, his stomach rumbling, he started scrolling on various social media apps as he ate, to distract himself from thinking. Peter was so exhausted though, so after he finished the pizza, he sent a quick text to Meg explaining that his day had gone well and that he was planning on sleeping at the tower. And then he felt himself dozing off on the sofa. He remained that way for at least a couple hours, flat out asleep, until there was a shuffling of footsteps and someone quietly flickered one of the lights on. One of Peter's eyes lazily opened, but he wasn't worried. The only people who had access to the apartment, other than him, were Pepper and Tony, and they had to do a biometric scan to get in anyways. This was just Tony finally arriving home from the mission. He was right. "Hey kid," Tony ruffled his hair as he came into the room. "I heard you gave Williamson a talking to." "How do you know? Fry?" Peter was sleepy. He could see Tony, but it was hazy. He was still half asleep, safe in the comfort of Tony's sofa. "No, Friday didn't say anything. Pepper told me. I tried your phone, but it went straight to voicemail." "Good." Tony hadn't seen what the Colonel had said about him. Tony sat next to him in the small space between Peter's feet and the edge of the sofa. "Sorry, I was asleep." Peter yawned and sat up. "It's okay, kid. Your day was probably more tiring than mine." Tony's voice sounded exhausted too, though. He probably needed to sleep just as much as Peter did. But hell, they were both pretty much insomniacs. They could handle a 5-minute chat. "How was your mission?" Peter asked. "It was all good. We got Bruce's friend to safety and arrested the bad guys. Clint broke his arm from a fall, but other than that, everything is okay." Peter bit his lip. Whenever one of them got injured, he was reminded of just how breakable they were. Just human, all of them. Well, except Thor, he supposed. Thank God Tony had a suit of metal to keep him mostly protected. He normally came away with a cut at least, but rarely any serious injuries. Good. Sorry for disturbing your winter break with Stark stuff. I knew you wanted to spend some time with your friends. Peter waved it off. "It's okay, Mr. Stark." Peter smiled. "It was a good day. Productive. Pep's back to work tomorrow, so you're relieved of your duty as CEO. Hopefully Ned would be around for a Lego session tomorrow. And then he could make up for flaking on him today." Peter could explain to him all the crazy things he'd done today, including shouting at a U.S. military official. "I think I'm going to sleep for the next 48 hours. He was exhausted." "Yeah, me too." Well, that was a lie. Although Mr. Stark probably should sleep for the next 2 days. It'd be the most sleep he'd had all year. "Mr. Stark, we both know you're going to get 4 hours sleep, and then get cracking on repairing your suit." Tony chuckled and nodded. "Look, Pete, well done for today. I don't say it enough, but you're a great kid." "Thanks, Mr. Stark." They quieted, and Peter curled up onto the sofa, finding his eyes closed once again. Tony did the same thing. Content, Pete felt himself slipping off into the darkness once again, finally ending the long day he'd had. Alright guys, and that is the end of chapter 1 of the Heir to Stark Industries by Only Forward. I hope you guys liked it, and I'll see you next chapter.